I did 1927, averaged 91.09, was one of Wisden 5 cricketers. So, but he, on a fairly small number of matches. It was pretty obvious he would go then to Australia in 28 under Percy Chapman. There was some talk, I believe, that he might even have been captain, but Chapman never became captain. And I suppose that was really his first lengthy exposure to Australia and Australians, and that really rather formulated his views going forward, didn't he? He didn't much care for the experience, I think, let's say.
Yes, I think that is absolutely true. I think it's worth pointing out that off the field, I mean, Jardine, had a number of very good Australian friends, probably contacts in a number of cases, who tended to be more of the sort of probably Anglo upper class type, if one is truthful. And I think, often at sort of, particularly in 32-3, when he was captain, most of the sort of events and functions he attended, he was genuinely pretty popular. By then he was quite a good speaker. He could be quite wry, and so he was normally pretty humble. And I think most Australians in those circumstances liked him. But the three big bugbears for him, of course, were one, the Australian crowds, two, the Australian press, and thirdly, the Australian Cricket Board, although of course I should mention certain individuals, and particularly on the field of play. And I think the thing about the Australians, I mean, I worked out there, taught out there, and I got to know Australia pretty well, and sort of, that sort of breezy informality, which, can be, very heartwarming and all the rest of it, but sometimes perhaps can be, particularly in that sort of age of deference, which Jardine was used to, could come across as a bit too blokish. And the engine driver coming up to him is sort of filthy and say, "Hey, Mr. Jardine, here are the ashes," and he just looking at him, thinking, "Who is this man?" And of course, but I think the real trouble that he had, certainly in 28, was the crowds, and the main reason was because of his slow scoring. I mean, almost in every single test. I mean, Jardine, who started the tour with 3 consecutive centuries, which has never been done before or since on a Ashes tour, and was in prime form in his opener, but then he did go back down to number 5 in the order. And often, of course, in those days of timeless tests, on sort of featherbed wickets, there was a lot to be said for really getting your head down and playing yourself in and not giving it away. And Jardine perhaps took that to excess on occasions, and he did rile the crowds. And I think then, I mean, I don't think it was just the case of the Harlequin cap, which they immediately, in the choker, which they depicted as privilege and therefore were against it. I mean, after all, Arthur Gilligan, who'd been hugely popular as captain in 24-5, had worn one, as indeed did Percy Chapman, who was equally popular in 28-9. But I think later, because Jardine, rather like Mike Brearley in 1979, lacked that ability to talk back to the crowd, to wave, to do a Tony Greig or something, wave to them, sort of smile, sort of do something, which, those kind of crowds love. And Jardine would just stare at them sort of rather acidly and haughtily. And of course, that made matters even worse. And so by the end, I think, yes, they did see the cap as a sign of sort of haughtiness and privilege and all the rest of it, and jokes about, rather like Jim Swanson in a later date about his butler and all the rest of it, sort of began to emerge.
I think that 28 tour, you do begin, you do see the sort of the embers of what happened in 32, 33 there. I mean, obviously Larwood was on that tour and bowled very fast, Bradman was there, who batted well but not magnificently, and you could almost hear Jardine's cogs whirring about what he might do were he to come back again. And of course, then when the Australians came back to England, it was a completely different story, and Bradman really sort of came up. And I think at that point, Jardine probably thought, well, if we do go back there again, what are we going to do about Bradman? And there's an interesting bit in the book about where this plan was formulated, and secondly, how many other members of the team knew about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the story goes back to Surrey's match against the Australians in May 1930. Remember, as we've mentioned, that Percy Fender, in addition to his cricketing duties, obviously was a journalist, been out in Australia in 28-9, and had made song and dance about Bradman, and sort of said, well, I'm not so sure, you wait till he gets over on English wickets, they'll sort of get him at the Oval on a wet day. Well, they did get him at the Oval on a wet day, 252 not out. And Bradman, as he entered the Australian dressing room at the end of the day, he said, "No, I wonder what Percy's going to be writing about me tomorrow." Sort of, and so yes, I mean, it became quite clear that Bradman by now, I mean, rather like 1976, Viv Richards suddenly came on the scene, didn't he? He got that 230 in the first test, and never sort of looked back from then on. And you said, "Gosh, this man's a genius." And I think people very quickly said that about Bradman, and of course they won back the Ashes, and the thought then of going back to Australia and bowling on those batting friendly wickets with Bradman in the side, sort of was a nightmare just to think about. And so Fender and Jardine and maybe one or two others had put their thinking caps on, and it's always said, and I think probably correctly, that Jardine thought that the one potential chink in Bradman's armory was his ability to play the short ball on sort of middle and leg stump, against really quick bowling on a difficult wicket. I mean, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and after all, he did get 232, but that was the weakness. That's what they had to plug. And of course, I mean, sort of leg theory had become, well, it had been around for 30 odd years. It'd become fast leg theory, had become more popular as the bowlers try to get back against the batsman. And now you suddenly had, in particularly Larwood, but also Vos, two, fast bowlers with the capacity to bowl the sort of kind of body line stuff. And so it is always said, and I think correctly, that meeting at the Piccadilly Hotel on 1st of August 1932 during the Yorkshire-Surrey match was very much the genesis of the plan, when Jardine sort of saying to Larwood and Vos, "Can you do it?" And they said yes. Now, people then say, well, that's all very well, but why didn't Gubby Allen, Les Ames and Bob Wyatt, the vice captain, know about it? And they claimed afterwards that the first they knew anything about it was when it was employed against the Australian 11 about the fifth match in a match, of course, in which Wyatt, rather than Jardine, who was fishing 200 miles away, was the captain. Well, I think the answer is this, that Jardine never believed that body line was the be all and end all of their tactics. There was plenty of other ways, necessary to bowl at Australians in an orthodox manner. And it's quite possible that he didn't mention, his plan to the others because he knew they were going to oppose it. And so what happened in the Australian 11, Bob Wyatt would say, was more old-fashioned leg theory. The board lost its shine early, the Australians were strong on the leg side, so bung a couple of people across. And it just so happened it worked very well. Bradman was getting out cheaply at that stage in that match, in the previous one, and then the future one against New South Wales. And all of a sudden, there's that feeling, well, gosh, actually, maybe there is something in it. And they employ it in the next match against New South Wales. And all of a sudden, people are then thinking, well, actually, yeah, we'll go with it in the test match. Gabby Allen accepted, of course, who wouldn't bowl. And the irony was, of course, the plan which was designed for Bradman wasn't playing in that first test. So I mean, I think, it's like probably a number of plans in sort of history. I mean, it might have been dreamt up, but actually then putting it into practice is another matter. And it's a combination of sort of ideology, if you like, plus pragmatism and circumstances.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's always struck me as one of those things that they're thought about, but not necessarily thought about doing. I mean, I was reading this morning one of the lengthy postmortems about the recent Ashes tour, about the similarity between Silverwood as effectively manager and coach and Root. They're sort of similar characters. Of course, the manager down was Pelham Warner. Yeah. Now, I think, again, two completely dissimilar characters you couldn't imagine. I mean, Warner sort of liked, he was very sort of emollient. Jardine completely the opposite. Although Warner, of course, selected him.
Absolutely. And gosh, if Jardine's a complex man, I think Plum Warner is even more complex. I mean, I think it's easy to depict that Warner, as you say, as a emollient diplomat and things. One also needs to remember that Warner had been twice a victorious captain in Australia, second time mainly from the boundary because he was injured, admittedly. But underneath all that politeness and charm, there lurked, as I think with so many of the amateurs, actually, Gabby Allen would be another one, there lurked a fanatical desire to win. And indeed, it is said that when the winning hit was made at Brisbane in 1932, Gabby Allen started singing "Now Thank We All Our God" with heart and hand and voices, so I mean, Plum Warner. So, he was hugely competitive. And maybe that, the real problem was, I mean, there was clearly a problem about, as Plum Warner saw it, as Jardine hating Australians. And that comes across in the letters. And clearly, on a personal level, for one reason or another, they fall out big time. But on the question of Bodyline itself, and Warner, of course, had been, very much against it prior to the war when writing in that match, Yorkshire Surrey at the Oval, when ironically enough, Jardine had to swap from a couple of beamers, and then Bowes was bowling short at all the Surrey men, and Warner, of course, wrote very strongly about this, both in the Cricketer and the Morning Post. But then days later, as chairman of the selectors, he adds Bowes to the tour in replacement for Maurice Tate, although Tate, of course, then did still go. And it seems to me that most of the actual disputes over Bodyline are more on the sort of kind of diplomatic side rather than on the ethical side. Now, I may be wrong on that one, but I mean, what Warner doesn't want to be doing the whole time is having to explain it away to the Australian press. But if Bodyline meant actually beating the Australians, I'm not so sure that he worried quite as much about that, I mean, certainly Duncan Hamilton, his Larwood's most recent biographer, and a very good one, in a very good book, calls Warner some pretty unflattering adjectives, duplicitous and oleaginous and a number of others. And although that might be taking things a little bit too far, I do think, that he's not entirely straightforward. I mean, certainly there is a big falling out, whichever way you look at it. But just to depict, Jardine as a man of war and Plum Warner as a man of peace, maybe a trifle simplistic.
Yeah, I think it almost certainly is. But so we come to the sort of the business part of the Ashes. I mean, England won quite easily in Sydney. Bradman wasn't playing. Bodyline was barely bowled, and then lost in Melbourne. And Bradman got 100. So it all really came to the fore at Adelaide. A famous incident with Bill Woodfall, and really everything kicked off there, and that wonderful line of Jardine, well bowled, Harold.
Yes, absolutely.
Again, from that terrible Australian thing we said, well bowled, Harold. It was absolutely brilliant, wasn't it? But just explain that a little bit.
Well, 50,000 at the Adelaide Oval on the second day of the match, Saturday, has seen England dismissed for 340 odd. And this is what I suppose they've all come to see. Larwood opening from the River Torrens end with that huge, beautiful run up. Woodfall coming in, opening with Fingleton, who of course goes very quickly. And at the almost immediately, was it to think in the second over, I mean, last ball of the second over, Woodfall takes a terrible blow from Jardine, from Larwood in the heart. I mean, he wasn't bowling Bodyline, to be fair. And, he staggers to the ground and he causes absolute uproar from this sort of vast crowd. And this, remembering, is the most respectable of all the Australian cities. South Australia was the one non-convict colony, and anyway, I mean, Woodfall is just taking his time to recover. Jardine sort of walks in impassively from cover right next to, goes up to the bowler and within Bradman's earshot says, well bowled, Harold. And then, of course, at the first ball, the next over, Larwood, halfway through his run up, Harold, stop, shot. He switches everybody over to the Bodyline field. And of course, that absolutely sets everybody off again and brings those comments from people like Bob Menzies and saying, this really was the absolute ultimate in provocation in showing that Bodyline had a physical side to it. And I think even Jardine did quietly admit later that maybe in hindsight, this was one thing he might not have done again. But that was certainly, got the crowd sort of down his back for the rest of the day.
And of course, England won in Adelaide. There was then the affair of the telegrams, the unsportsmanlike behaviour, which had to be withdrawn by the Australians. But the boot was very much or the advantage was very much with Lords there, wasn't there? Because the Australians needed the tour to go ahead, and therefore they had to withdraw. And effectively, Lords had to back their captain, and of course that all fizzled out. And England won a remarkable victory that Warner must have been happy about, but probably, I suspect, had a little doubt in the back of his mind about the way in which it.
Yeah, no, I mean, as I say, his letters home reveal by then a sort of near hatred of Jardine a lot of the time, and and then I'm sure, Jardine was the kind of person that, if he took against you, as I said earlier, I mean, he made it pretty plain, and he included the England manager in that, the MCC manager, who he felt hadn't been supportive enough and had been sort of rather, double-faced and all the rest of it. So there was clearly, animosity on both sides. Yes, as regards the telegram, the Australians, of course, overdid it with unsportsmanlike behaviour, which of course was a rag to the bull, to the MCC hierarchy back at Lords and the press and the public and everybody else. And as you rightly say, of course, if nothing else, it was bringing in huge revenue into, and so the last thing they wanted was for the tour to be abandoned. And of course, the other thing was that it was against a background of great economic and political fragility at the time. I mean, as we all know, this was the middle of the Depression, and the Australian economy was reliant on bankers' loans from over here and all the rest of it, and various trade treaties. And it wasn't in their interest at this moment in time, to make an enemy of their mother country over something as trivial as, bodyline. So, political. So the Australian Prime Minister Joseph Lyons and the Viscount Helsham, who was the Secretary of State for War, a very good position to be in the cabinet at that time, as well as being MCC president, got together and I think sort of, got the two sides back together, and the Australian board withdraw the word unsportsmanlike and all the rest of it, so that it could go ahead. And actually, I mean, the final two tests, I mean, the Brisbane test was an absolute epic, remembered by Eddie Painter coming to the rescue from hospital at a crucial time. And I think what is worth saying is that whatever Australians thought about Jardine as a person, or what they thought about him as bodyline, to a man, and indeed, to a woman, that they were absolutely unanimous in their praise of him as a captain. I mean, the word genius was often used. One of the things which I read, probably like a lot of people here, one of the complaints about Root's captaincy was he bowled Stokes into the ground, and prior to that, of course, he bowled Jofra Archer into the ground. Mistake that Jardine never made. Yes, there were some quite long spells, but he never, if they felt that they were no longer up to it, they came off. And as a general rule, I think he was brilliant at the way of setting individual fields for the Australian batsmen, for keeping his bowlers fresh. And I suppose the ultimate in leadership, getting the very best out of his players. And even those people who weren't, entirely supportive of bodyline, nevertheless, were not going to go public about it. I mean, even Gubby Allen in that famous meeting, didn't actually bring up bodyline, because they had so much admiration for Jardine's leadership. And what was most interesting, I think, is that in that meeting, when things after, right at the end of the Adelaide test, when the flak was really flying, it was the sort of the northern core of the team, Larwood and Vos, Nottinghamshire, the four Yorkshire players, Maurice Leyland, Sutcliffe, Bill Bowes, Tommy Mitchell, Derbyshire, George Duckworth of Lancashire, the real boot room, as it were, remained absolutely rock solid behind Jardine and his tactics, because he was playing the kind of cricket that they were used to. But more than that, they had come to admire him so much as an individual. Yes, I mean, there have been occasions, of course, during the 4 or 5 months when the discipline seemed a bit tight, words were said at practice. But I think what they really admired about him is that they knew he would fight for them, over wages, over giving the families presents at Christmas, just going out of his way. Somebody hadn't seen the pyramids, Duckworth, all right, I'll lay that on. Offered Larwood a free holiday in New Zealand at the end of the trip when he was injured. I mean, lots of little things in the background, laying champagne on for the quick bowlers at the drinks intervals, anything if that was going to get them. Yeah, hidden out there in the drinks, it sort of worked. That great story, actually, when during the Brisbane test, Larwood and Vos, they'd been told, look, early to bed, please. And the first night, I think it was, when Australia made something like 270 for 3 in that stinking heat, And Larwood and Vos, they were in their rooms, and somebody, Australian mate of theirs, gone on the phone and said, look, come on, come out. Oh, no, we can't, Mr. Jardine. Oh, don't be so worried about him. Okay, well, we'll just come out, we'll have a glass of orange juice and go back, you know. And anyway, you know, they go out, there's a huge keg of beer, they can't resist it. And of course, they drink and they get drunk. And Larwood, you know, they go back to the hotel about 1 in the morning, and Larwood starts singing songs, and oh no, you know. And anyway, Larwood had already taken on a bet with an Australian journalist that he'd get Bradman out in the first half an hour, which he duly did. And Jardine went across to sort of Vos or one of the others and said, thanks very much for keeping an eye on Harold last night.
Yeah, there's some great stories there. I mean, I find it incredible that yes, they had magnificent respect for him, but almost every member of the team fell out with him over something at some point. Sure. It was absolutely incredible. But that was the Ashes. Jardine sort of stayed involved. He was captain of the West Indies when the West Indies came over here, and Bodyline was bowled at him by Constantine and Martindale, but he stood up to it. He didn't complain. Couldn't really complain, I suppose, but he stood up to it. He then went out to India as captain in '34. And then, of course, the Australians were coming back here, but the boot was very much on the other foot there, wasn't it? Because war was coming, Britain needed Australia's support. Australia said, we want to guarantee you're not going to do what you've done before. And that was effectively the end of it for Jardine, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the Australians were quite clever about it. I mean, they in the same way that obviously they'd made a lot of money out of the tour, they knew that a full-scale tour of England was absolute manna heaven for the equivalent of the TCCB on the counties. And so they were in quite a strong position to be able to bargain away. And they managed to get the MCC effectively to say, okay, we won't bowl Bodyline, helped by the fact that, as you say, Martindale and others had bowled it, Constantine in 1933 over here, as indeed a number of other English bowlers, you know, and there've been some quite serious injuries. Ken Farnes hit several people in the varsity match, and that had gone down very badly. So, you know, now that the boot was on the other foot and English crowds have seen a number of their own players being hit, they didn't like it. So, yeah, you know, Bodyline was banned. And I think Jardine saw the writing on the wall. I'm clear that there was no, well, there were various attempts by Warner and perhaps Alexander Hall, Ruffin, Lord Gowrie in Australia, the Governor General of Australia by then, to get him sacked as captain. But I think in the end, it genuinely was his decision, maybe because he knew that he would be asked to ensure that, you know, he didn't bowl Bodyline, which he wasn't prepared to tolerate. But I think also, you know, he was about to get married, he needed more money. And I think, you know, to him, the game was changing and he didn't like the growing commercialization and the intrusiveness of the press, et cetera, et cetera. And so add all that together and, you know, and of course, a very good contract to write for the Evening Standard. He was prepared to give it away. And I think also the other thing was his fitness actually was not as great as it had been actually, and became an increasing problem thereafter, even in minor games actually. Yeah, so I mean, but it did cause quite a stink, because I think a lot of people felt that Jardine had been let down, and certainly that's been one of the things which is I've been interested in when people have talked to me about the book, and which has come across, is how a number of people feel that, you know, on his behalf, that he was let down by, you know, MCC, etc.
Yep, no, I think I agree with that. Well, we've come to the end of our first hour, Mark. There's still quite a lot to cover. We'll have some questions after that. But thank you very much for an excellent first hour.
No, not at all.